Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Qdabra weekly webinar. I am recording this. I remembered to push the recording button, and I can see I remembered to unmute myself. So far, it's been a great day for me. My name is Hillary Stupa, and I'm a developer at Qdabra. And today we are going to talk about designing a responsive PowerApps application. So I'll just dive right in. Our topics today are the settings that are required for a responsive app. We're going to talk a little bit about aspect ratio concepts. There's going to be some math. If you don't know me, you may not know that Hooray is sarcastic. I'm renowned for my inability to math. There are some new properties that I want to discuss, and as always, there's going to be some gotchas. So I want to warn you before we get started that building a responsive app is possible, but it's not easy. Based on the release on Tuesday, where some new properties were introduced, I'm assuming that the designer experience is in flux and that this is going to change a lot. And I have the feeling that it's going to change a lot in the near future. Just because an app I worked on last week when I was doing my prep for this webinar performs differently published in the latest version of PowerApps, and we're going to talk about that because I think that's a serious gotcha, and I want to make sure we address that when we're discussing this. So if you are watching this video on YouTube in the year 2023 and it doesn't work like this anymore, that's anticipated. And actually, if you're watching this video on YouTube next month and it doesn't work like this anymore, at this point, that's also anticipated. So no need to leave me a comment telling me this doesn't work. Just go ahead and check the documentation and move on because things are definitely in flux with this functionality. A lot of times when I do the webinar, I sort of demo as I go along. I don't want to do that today. I just feel like some of these concepts are complicated. I want to take a look at the documentation together. And I think it's just going to be simpler if we just sort of pop through the slides and then get into the meat of things. So that's the approach I'm going to take today. So looking at the app settings, I would suggest that you start with any layout you prefer to design in. You're going to need to, under advanced settings, turn scale to fit off. That's going to also turn off lock aspect ratio. And you're going to be using the app width and the app height to help dynamically size and position things, as well as leveraging parent items like enhanced groups. Enhanced groups are a new feature. These are available in an ordinary production environment, not just in preview environment. So in your ordinary production environment, you should be able to find this setting to turn on. And when you turn on the enhanced group control, grouping behaves differently. So once you turn that on, groups are going to be available under the controls menu. They become a control in and of themselves. It gives you more control over layout and nesting. And the enhanced group control has its own properties. Now, I don't know if you realize this because I sure didn't realize this, but the original group control in PowerApps, it's an aggregate container. So it's not really its own thing. It's just an aggregate of whatever's inside of it. So like the height or the width of that is going to change if you change a control inside of that. And the boundaries of your group extend and compress based on the controls inside of them. I had no idea. It had never occurred to me. But with this enhanced group, you have a boundary. You have a literal, well, as literal as anything on a screen can be, right? You have a container object that has hard boundaries. And so if you go and pull something around in there, it's going to be constrained by that container. And that is definitely something we're going to look at in the demo because as you will hear as we progress, as unexcited as I am about the possibilities of responsive app design in its current iteration, I'm very excited about the enhanced group control. I think it has a lot of great features, and I would definitely encourage you to try the enhanced group control. The child controls inside of it the X and the Y are relative to the group now instead of to the parent screen, so things stay in place a little more nicely. You can nest groups. I will not lie, I have not nested groups yet, but having dealt with InfoPath for so long and nested repeating stuff, just the idea of being able to nest makes me as happy as a little bird. I like being able to nest things. And it has its own color, border, and visible properties. And that's important because, you know, I can foresee a lot of instances where under some circumstances, I want the entire group to hide. Under other circumstances, I just want some things inside of it to hide. And I think those things are going to be useful. Okay, so we'll take a look at those differences. Some of the important concepts for building a responsive design. So you need to understand your app and your screen dimensions. There's app width and app height, and that's the actual height and width of the running application. And then there's design width and design height, and those are the settings you set when you, I'm going to use the word settings again, and I'm sorry, when you set the settings for your app in the design mode, okay? You want to leverage parent objects, not just the screens, but your enhanced group control, the template in your gallery, which, by the way, when you add a gallery now, there's a lot of things that do use parent height and parent width, and that's great. And then the same thing if you start building components. The last time I did a webinar, it was Valentine's Day, and I was talking about how much PowerApps loves you because of having components now. And so you definitely want to be thinking about leveraging parents if you design components, okay? And so the parent is literally, sorry with the literallys, I don't know what's up with that today. The parent is the object that the parent is whatever your object is sitting in. So if you think, if you're an InfoPath developer, and I know a lot of times we end up with InfoPath developers because we've got this deep, rich history of working with InfoPath. So if you've done InfoPath development, I think in terms of how if you put a button in a section, the section is the parent of the button, right? And so if you're writing XPath related to hiding or showing that button, it's all going to be relative to that parent section. It's the same sort of idea. You've worked with parents before. It's the same type of idea. It should be comfortable, okay? You're going to want to use formulas for dynamic layout. This is the math part. There's some interesting points in one of the documents we're going to look at that I think are conceptually well written, and I think are very good to review and understand in terms of trying this yourself. And also you want to think about orientation. So the orientation setting is in the same place as lock aspect ratio and allowing things to move around. And you've got to determine whether you're going to let users flip the screen. Is that going to make a difference if they flip the screen? Okay. Now don't be like me and write formulas related to orientation and then be confused on your desktop computer why those formulas do not work, okay? Because I had a very perplexing moment yesterday when I was trying to understand why one thing worked on my laptop and another thing did not. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that, you know what, my laptop doesn't have an orientation. It is sitting on my desk looking straight at me, whereas my phone and my tablet do have an orientation. So as you're working with this, again, don't make my mistakes. That's why I'm so honest with you about the mistakes I make, right? Now, there are new properties. As far as I can tell, at least as of yesterday, these new properties were available in my preview environment. So remember, we've got several different types of preview things. There's features that are in preview, but you can use in your production environment. They're often called experimental features. And then there's an actual preview environment where you go and you create a new environment, you select preview, and it's got some of the latest changes, right? So that gives you a chance to try some of these things before they move into production. Completely different environments. So again, yesterday, these things were only in my preview environment. Who knows today, right? We'll find out shortly, won't we? We are living on the edge. Screen orientation is one of them. It's a property of the screen. There's screen size, again, that's a property of the screen. And then there's custom breakpoints, which are size breakpoints, and those are an app property. Again, we're going to take a look at the documentation. I just wanted to kind of bop through my slide deck first. Gotchas. Okay, so gotchas. If you have used a formula to set, for example, the X or the Y or the height or the width of a control like an enhanced group, and then you go and on the canvas, you grab one of the convenient little handles and you drag it bigger, or you grab the whole thing and you move it around, your formula will be removed and it'll be replaced with a hard-coded number. Now that makes complete sense, because why, if you've manually set the width, would PowerApps know that you actually meant to retain your formula? There's no way to determine user intent there. So that makes complete sense. And what you'll want to do is just get in the habit of working in the function bar once you start using formulas for some of these things. So know if you are working on something responsive that you want to get up in that function bar and start typing and keep your little greedy mouse off the canvas, okay? The next gotcha is a bad one. And well, the next two gotchas are bad ones. The next one's a bad one, in my opinion. You can't preview responsiveness, okay? So all of this responsive design stuff where we're using app height and app width, those are determined when the app is played. They're not determined when the app is previewed. So if you're in Designer and you push that little play button because you want to see how things are going, you will not get your responsive design experience. That means that when you make changes, you have to publish them and check them in the published app. Now, I know we all have perfectly normal fears about publishing stuff we are working on into production, and those are good fears to have. We should be afraid of these things. So at this point, I would say if you have a production app and it's a responsive app and you need to make changes to that, probably best to export it, import a copy of it that you can use for your testing. And then I believe you can use save as to overwrite your production app. So once you have a copy of it that you're working with for your testing, when you've got it just right and you've tested it entirely, use save as and overwrite your production version. And that would be my best suggestion at this point. Actually, because of gotcha number 3, my suggestion right now would be don't try to build a responsive app. And I know it's kind of discouraging to come to a webinar where we're like, hey, let's show you how to build a responsive app. And somebody's going to say, don't do it. But I have good reasons for saying this. And the reason I say this is because last week when I built my demo app, it worked well. It worked well on my phone. It worked well on my desktop. There were a couple of things I didn't like about it that I thought, you know, I could improve this. I've got some thoughts for making this a little nicer. It's not, you guys know my demos. It's not nice to begin with, but it worked. And then they updated PowerApps. I made a minor change. I republished it. And it did not resize correctly on my phone any longer. And it looked and behaved differently on my laptop as well. And this was yesterday when I discovered this, and I was not amused. I was deeply not amused. And I rolled it back to a prior version. Thank heavens that worked, so I can show you what was working. The documentation was changed and updated between last week when I did this and this week. So there were some differences there. And I feel as if this is in flux, and I feel as if unless you just absolutely have to have this, and it is not something mission critical. Okay, if you are my rocket surgeon, if you are my my accountant, if you are my lawyer, I would prefer you not use PowerApps, responsive apps for this functionality, because I think there's too much of a chance that something might change, and that change could be a breaking change on republish. So I just want you to be super aware of that if you make the decision to try this out. You know, I'm a big fan of this releasing new functionality regularly. I'm not against that. I like it, but you know, it's frustrating when things worked last week and they don't this week. Okay, so keep in mind that my frustration may be seeping out here just a little bit, and I don't have a way of knowing if last week I was taking advantage of a bug that got fixed this week, or if there is a bug this week that broke what worked last week. You see, so because I can't even ascertain that, I'm not really sure what the problem is. Regardless, we are going to take a look at some demos because I prepared them and I am stubborn and we are going to look at them. And so let me show my taskbar here real quick and we will pop over here. Now I blasted up my my browser size just a little bit, so I'm hopeful everything shows pretty well. So this was the original announcement. This was the announcement, and I've got links to these things in the slide deck. Okay, so be sure you well, I'll send you guys a copy of the slide deck. Okay, so there's links in the slide deck to these things. So this announcement was back in March. I was excited about this, and that's when I volunteered to do the webinar. I was like, oh, this is neat. And so if you take a look at this little GIF they've got here, you can see how things are shifting as they resize on a desktop. It talks about turning off scale to fit and how to write some expressions. And it has a little simple example. And you can see as they're expanding and collapsing this, how these numbers are changing, right? The rectangle size and the app playing size. And we'll take a look at some of those numbers, okay? The documentation I've mainly been referring to is this one. Again, there is a link in the slide deck. And this is about just some basic concepts for creating responsive design. And there are some good things in here. Okay, it definitely talks about the difference between design width and design height versus app width and app height. You want to review that. It has some basic formulas to help you get dynamic layout going in terms of using, you know, parent height, parent width. And here's like some basic formulas in terms of using parent height, parent width to divide the screen between a group and another group, or you could use it for a gallery and a detail container or something along those lines. You can also, you know, if you follow along here, you can take a look at this one. It has some more complex formulas to help you if you decide down the road that you want to modify that structure to make it so you aren't rewriting a ton of formulas. Again, all really good information. Now, if you start moving down into this, you can see we've got some good information on creating relationships, determining what the spacing would be, using formulas in order to get your objects to align in a certain fashion, okay? And they also talk about hierarchical layout and get into the enhanced group control. And there's also, I've got a link for you here on the enhanced group control. So you're gonna wanna take a look at these things and it'll give you a good sense of them. Where this documentation I found started to fall apart for me yesterday was right here. Now, hopefully this bug will be fixed soon. If you've used PowerApps much at all, you'll see that this is not a valid if statement, okay? I would assume, because we've got too many arguments, right? You can see there's a valid if statement right below it. I'm assuming that this parent height comma is the typo, and I did go ahead and file a bug with them on it so that they know about it. Okay, so there's a little bug there you want to be aware of. The other thing you want to be aware of is these formulas are all referring to orientation, which aren't going to be relevant if you are working with something on your desktop. Okay, so these are formulas that are not going to flex for you on your desktop app. They would on your tablet versus your phone, and they would only come into play if you had your orientation set to allow the user to reorient the screen. You need to be aware of that. The other thing I'd like you to be aware of, and this could just be me, and the last thing I want to do is be hashing somebody else's documentation, but I went through this twice yesterday to try to build a phone app that would change orientation as I moved the phone. I was not successful, okay? So just be aware. So let's take a look at, let me pop up my demo notes here. So let's take a look at this guy. This is my simple responsive test app, and I will get you guys a copy of it. One thing I want to mention that was just made obvious to me recently, if you've read the coding standards, you'll see they mention very specifically about screen naming, and I just want to highlight this in terms of accessibility, okay? Screen names are read aloud by screen readers. So if you've got users, or if you anticipate you'll have users with vision accessibility needs, that actual name of your screen is what's read out loud. So it's really good to use full words, spaces, and the word screen, okay? I just wanted to highlight that because I think accessibility is extremely important and it's a good thing to keep in mind. There's a couple new features I wanted to show you. If you haven't looked at PowerApps recently, this app thing is new. That's the app property itself. You'll see the on start property is there now. Oh, and look, size breakpoints is now available. So it looks like these new properties are now available in regular environments, in my regular environment, not just in preview. So size breakpoints are a new property and on start is a new property. The other thing, I don't know if you remember, but in the past, if you added an on start, you would have to save, close your app, and reopen it for that on start to run when you previewed your app. And now they have this fresh and friendly run on start button that you can use to run that instead. Another thing that's new that's been recently changed is you can now have a trailing semicolon. So in the past, if you had a trailing semicolon, you would have an error. And now if you have a trailing semicolon, you do not have an error. And the reason that's handy, I'm just going to make a little mess here. The reason that's handy is if you were debugging and let's say you had a bunch of statements and you were like, I don't understand what's going wrong here. And you went to comment out a statement. What a pain if you also have to, remove that semicolon and then add it back in. It's a little problematic. So it was a tiny little change they made, but hopefully it will make using formulas a little easier. And plus, as someone who writes a lot of C# and JavaScript, I'm just used to having a semicolon at the end of my statement. And so I personally deeply appreciate that. And one thing I want to ask you, and there will be, there's a question on this in the poll, not the poll, the survey afterwards, is whether you consider this language, this function language, do you consider it more like Excel or more like code? I heard it mentioned in a Microsoft webinar, somebody was talking about these being Excel-like functions. And as somebody who writes code, I snorted in a most unladylike fashion. I was like, are you kidding me? That's code. But at any rate, I'd be curious about your opinions, and I've got a question on that in the survey. Okay, so I wanted to show you, let me see if I've got my, let me get my app up here on my phone. I wanted to show you on my phone. And let me pop this over. Sorry, I had this up earlier and then it keeps going to sleep because I'm using a free version of Lonely Screen, but that's all right. Let me pop this up. Okay. All right, we're going to try that again in just a second. I'll show you from here what we've got going on. So here is my original app, and I'm going to play it. And I want to resize this window a bit. So you can see I've got this bar that goes across the top. I've got a single button that does a navigate, add data. Okay, so you can see I've got two pieces on this screen. I've got basically a gallery, and on the right-hand side, I've got the details for my gallery. And and the font could be bigger. I had some thoughts about how I might do that. But in general, it's functional. And whoops, I dragged that out of the way. I was trying to get my phone showing again. And now if I resize it, do you see how everything moved a little bit? We don't have stuff falling off. And if I resize it more, you can see if I learn how to resize, nice, how do they work, right? You can see how it dropped down below. Okay, so this was my goal. This was what I had wanted for my app. And you can see that it all just, it resizes quite nicely. Everything kind of flows a little bit when I get to a certain point. My little title bar moves, my scroll bars, they keep disappearing, which is great because I didn't want scroll bars. And so, yeah, I was happy with this app. And I want to show it to you on my phone now that I've got that up. Let me just blast this up a little bit. So you can see here on my phone, it all looks just fine. I scroll and you guys, I don't build the most beautiful stuff, but we've got, something that's functional. And as I click on my stuff, you can see things are changing down here. So yesterday I republished it with a minor change because I was like, you know what? It's going to be easier to demo if I have a few more buttons on here because I had a couple more screens I wanted to show. So I put a few more buttons on there and I republished it, and it no longer worked. And so I restored it from a prior version. So my published version right now is restored to an earlier version of PowerApps, and I'll show you that in a sec. Here is my new version that was published with the latest version of PowerApps. Now you can see I added some buttons, but I didn't change anything about the settings. I didn't change anything about my formulas in terms of what I had where. And you can see this is just no longer resizing on my screen the way it had been. You can see my bottom section doesn't show. I have to scroll around to see things. This was not my desired effect, right? So this was not a good experience, okay, for me. So I'm just gonna go ahead and drop that phone down. And I had the same issue here in my on my laptop as well. So you can see if I run this in play on my laptop, and I do see I have a question, and we're going to have a questions time. So I'll take a look at that here in a little bit. Oh, this is not what I meant to do. I did not mean to edit. Why did you guys let me click the wrong button? Let me try again here. Let's play. Okay, so here it's popping up. Now this is my copy, and if we start dragging around, you know, we've got that top bar resizing down to a certain point, right? And then it stops. Unlike this one where everything was resizing. There's also font differences, and there's no difference in the font settings between these two. Okay, so I was perplexed. You could say annoyed. You know, all of those. I had a lot of feelings about this, right? And here now it moved over, so it's behaving okay on my desktop. I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with the fact that it no longer lays out as I would anticipate on my phone. And also it seems to be like there's a certain level that it will not get smaller than. Okay, so this is why I had those caveats. This is why I was like, hey, look out if you're doing this. I think there's changes going on that could affect you. And so if we go look at the versions for this guy, details, I was so happy for being able to roll back to a prior version. So see how my PowerApps release here is 3.4.12. Now this was the one I built last week. And then when I republished it yesterday, it went up to 4.1.12. And I immediately had a different experience. And in fact, the other one, the one that's called for testing, that guy is 4.1.12 and he behaves differently. Okay, so those are the things I am warning you about, and that's why. But let's go ahead and take a look at a few of the things we've talked about. So definitely you want to know where your app settings are. They're over here. Screen size and orientation, these are your important ones. You want to make sure you've got scale to fit, lock aspect ratio, and make a decision about orientation. The other thing I really encourage you to try is the enhanced group control. I just think it's fantastic. So if we go back and take a look at my test items screen here, I've got two groups. This group is a regular group. This group is an enhanced group. I'm going to blast up the size on this a little so we can all see the numbers. Okay, so the parent height on this enhanced group is 234, and that's because the parent of this label right here, we've got parent height, the parent of that label is the group. The parent height here, we can see that's parent height, is 1366. Why? Well, because the parent of that label is the screen. And in fact, you see how there's a difference? If I go and drag, I'm going to drag this. Do you see how my group itself is resizing as I drag that? That's what I meant about the old style groups aggregating the control, okay? Whereas here in my new group, if I try to drag it, do you see how I can't get out of there? I'm blocked, okay? So it's based on the size of the container. And so that's really useful in terms of being able to set things dynamically and have things move around. It's also, I think, going to be useful for a lot of other things. I just really am super fond of this group having its own properties. Okay, and so you're going to want to check that out. If we look at the I think I've got the Y set on this guy. Nope, I don't. Well, let's set the Y on this. Let's set this to parent height divided by 2. Okay, let's divide it by 3. Okay, so now he's at parent height divided by 3. So he's right smack in the middle. Because I've got deep ingrained laziness, I'm going to copy that formula so I don't have to type it twice. And now if I grab him and I move him, right, you see how the Y is changing? Well, of course it is. It's like we talked about. You know, how would anybody garner that my intent was not to change that? But do keep that in mind. Get used to working up here in your function bar as you work around. Now, in that screen that I have that is responsive, and works as I would like it to. I'm going to go ahead and see if I alt click this guy, if I can get my data loaded. There we go. And you guys, I'm going to send you these, even though, like I said, if you publish it, it's not working with the current version of PowerApps in the phone. I'm going to send them to you anyway, both of them, just so you've got them, so you can kind of see what I've done there. And the data is loading from a collection. Let me just drag this down. The data is loading from a collection, so you'll be able to run it without any data sources or anything like that. I just wanted to make sure it was something that was going to be usable. So let's just scroll this bad boy back up. Okay, so if we look at these two guys, the big things to take a look at here are going to be height. Okay, so here I'm setting the height. I'm saying if parent width is less than parent height divided by 3, otherwise parent height. Why? Right? So philosophical question of why. Well, width versus height helps you understand orientation, right? And this was before the new release of orientation properties, and also because I would also like this to work on my desktop. Okay, so this is basically parent height is going to be greater than width, then we want to use the whole canvas, right? Otherwise we don't. And then for our group, you can see if you look at the height, right? That's the wrong group. That's the title group. My bad. We look at group 6. I should have given things better names. I always tell you guys to give things good names, and I never do it. If we look at the height here, it's going to be the height of the parent, which is the whole screen, right, minus the Y for group 6. So that's dependent on its own Y. So let's go look at the Y. All right, and so now you can see this is dependent upon whether the screen is longer or wider, right? It's longer versus wider, okay? And so there's formulas like that throughout on the X, right? And again, that's gonna be, hey, I want this at 0 if we're tall and skinny. I want this next to the book gallery if we're wider. Okay, hopefully these things make sense. It took me a little while to kind of wrap my head around them. And then for width, let's just clean that out. For width, you can tell somebody copied and pasted our formulas. All right, so for width, we're taking the X of this particular group, of this own group, right? And we're taking the width of the parent and we're subtracting that X. So the X and Y are determining whether this falls underneath or next to. I hope that makes more sense to you than it did to me. It took me a little while, okay? Let me see what my other notes were about this. So those are those. I did the same thing with the title group. I made the title group based on the parent height, so that these things will all kind of change depending on the parent height, okay? Some of the new properties, we'll look at the new properties in just a second. One thing I wanted to mention, one thought I had, I mentioned that, there's some things I think that might look better. And one thought I had was a person could do something with fonts. For example, you might want to do something with your fonts, like in your app itself. You could do in an on start, something like that. Where you set small font to equal one size, large font equal to another. And then you could change what size of font you used based on the app width. So something like this on your button text. In my sample, I just used kind of a hard-coded thing, but you could do it based on one of the new screen size properties. So for example, the screen size property, small equals 1, medium equals 2, large equals 3, extra large equals 4, and apparently you can also determine your own. So you could definitely do something like if, let's see, what's our screen? Welcome screen dot Let's see if we've got size. We do. So these properties are in production now. Equals, sorry, equals screen size. I've got to look at these because they're new to me. Right, so we could say, you know, if it's equal to small, then we want to use small font. Otherwise, we want to use large font, right? Or we could do if it's equal to, if it's less than medium, or if less than large, or something along those lines. So your new screen size properties could help you with something like that. So that was one thing I was thinking of in terms of like dynamically setting font or something like that to make your font sizes more appropriate for the size of your screen. Here's the announcement for the new screen properties. And it talks about screen orientation. Again, I gave you the caveat about that. Make sure you understand that doesn't work on your desktop. There's screen size, and this talks about what the values are of small, medium, and large. So it's, you just want to know that small is 1, medium's 2, large is 3, extra large is 4. And apparently you can actually also make those larger. So with the custom breakpoints. So here's the custom breakpoints, and these are under your app settings. And so the screen size property compares the width to the size breakpoints property. These two are intertwined. So if you start using the size property, you can use size breakpoints to customize what those sizes are. Okay, and so that's definitely worth checking out if you start working on this. My hope is that this will also become easier, or there will be some samples that come out or something along those lines that will be helpful. All right, so that, I'm sorry, I know I started talking faster and faster because I was running, because I know I'm using up a lot of time, as I always do. But that's kind of the basics of it. Again, I cannot with any confidence suggest that you do this right now. I definitely hope that this gets easier, and I would like to revisit this in a little while and see if it does get easier. I've got a bunch of links for you back to all this documentation that we've looked at. I think some of this is useful now, even if you aren't actively building something responsive. I personally intend to start using Parent a lot more for things like determining location and size of things, just because people use different sizes screens on their desktops. I think it might make a nicer app experience if I'm working on something that might be on a tablet versus a desktop. Something that you want to take from phone to desktop, I would be very careful. I got burned, you guys. Don't get burned like I got burned. So definitely check it out. If you build something responsive successfully, I would like for you to let me know. You can always reach me at hillary.stupa@qdabra.com if you think of a question later. Okay, if there's, I'm checking my questions now. Is there an official language name for the code that goes into the function bar? Anything more official than Excel-like? I never know what to call that when collaborating. You know, this is such a big issue for me too. I don't really feel confident about what to call things in PowerApps, and I struggle a lot. I'm going to pop open, because I know we all really wanted to look at the coding standards PDF. So this is the white paper on coding standards, as I scroll through it so fast to give myself a headache. Naming conventions, I would think naming conventions, camel case for controls, screen names, data source names, code naming conventions. Okay, so I don't know when they wrote this white paper whether they were talking to the same person who announced that this was Excel-like formulas. I would say I usually call them functions, but these guys are saying right here, as you add code to your apps, it becomes important to use a consistent pattern. And, you know, it uses variables. It uses code-like syntax. I would call it code. I tend to refer to it, I think when I'm talking, I tend to refer to it as functions, which does sort of fall into line with the concept of it being Excel-like. And part of that is because of this, right? You see the FX and the drop down. So when I see an FX, I think functions, right? We see that in InfoPath. You click the FX to select from functions. You see that in Excel. So I tend to call it functions, but I think of it as code functions. So I don't know if that was helpful, but I would definitely suggest that if you are working with colleagues and building apps, that you check out the coding standards, review it, and maybe come to some design conventions internally that you're going to use, and maybe leverage that when you have questions. In terms of not being sure what a breakpoint means, I think that was probably in reference to these size breakpoints. And this, again, it's under the new properties, and it's right here. And what they're talking about here by size breakpoints is just what is small, okay? So if a screen size is small, what is small? And here they're saying it's 600 or less. What is medium? 900 or less. What is large? 1200 or less, okay? And so, good, okay, good. Then I won't beat it to death with my verbiage. But so yeah, those are the size breakpoints. There's defaults, and then you can set your own. Does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to pop them into chat. You guys know how to reach me. Feel free to reach out later. Please take the survey afterwards. I'm really curious about your feelings on this, whether you would give this a try even in the state it's in. And is this Excel-like functions, or is this code? What is this thing we're dealing with? Here's my, I've got a link. Sorry, there's another question. I've got a link to that in the slides, which I will send you. And let me paste it into chat real quick because it is important. Let's get those coding standards into chat. Sorry, guys, backing up. Let me see if I can copy this. Okay. I don't know what I'm doing, you guys. PowerPoint and I, we get along so well. Okay, so I'm going to paste this into chat. 1 second. Okay, here is a link to the announcement for the coding standards and guidelines, and there is a download right there. Okay, so you can get a hold of it. Now, let me pay my bills real quick. Here's my Forms Viewer promo. Do check out Forms Viewer if you need to keep your InfoPath investment going. We've got support for all kinds of great functions. And you guys, we're in the SharePoint store. Jimmy worked so hard to get us in the SharePoint store. So you can find Forms Viewer in the SharePoint store now if you want to get it added to your Office 365 site. Please take the survey after this, and I will send you guys the slides, and I'm going to send you my sad little demos, one of which works, and only if you're using an older version of PowerApps, and who knows what may happen next week. And thank you guys so much for attending, and I really appreciate you all. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.